The train doors opened with a metallic groan, and cold morning air rushed in, carrying a smell none of the women expected. Not smoke, not dust, not fear, but something warm, savory, almost unreal after years of hunger. Bacon. The scent drifted through the U.S. Army prison camp like a silent message. This war was different now. The women, former auxiliaries, nurses, radio operators, factory workers, had been captured in the final collapse of the Third Reich. Their futures were unknown. Some expected punishment. Some expected cruelty. Many expected death. But what they found instead was a world that none of them had been prepared to imagine. American towns, American soldiers, American food. And in that unfamiliar world, far from home and ravaged by war, something quietly extraordinary unfolded, not in the blast of battle, but in the fragile space between enemies who were no longer fighting. This is the story of how German women prisoners of war discovered humanity inside the wire fences of a foreign land, and how the smell of bacon, of all things, became the first sign that their lives were about to change forever. Asterisk, asterisk. In the final months of World War II, Germany was breaking apart at the seams. Cities lay in ruins, windows shattered into the streets like frozen tears. Rail lines buckled in twisted steel ribbons, factories silent except for the hollow sound of wind passing through broken walls. For years, propaganda had taught German women that the world outside their borders was a place of savagery, that enemies were ruthless, merciless, waiting to destroy them. Many of these women worked behind the front lines, operating radios, packing munitions, bandaging wounded soldiers, doing what they were told was duty. Not soldiers, yet still part of the war machine. And when the Allied forces swept in, some of these women were gathered, registered, and transported as prisoners, not out of hatred, but out of necessity. To ensure the chaos did not turn into something worse. Their journey to America felt like the world was being turned upside down. They were placed aboard ships that moved silently across the Atlantic, the waves endlessly rising and falling like breathing. The ship hull smelled of salt and oil. Some women cried quietly at night, keeping their tears hidden behind blankets. Others sat in silence, staring into the distance, trying to understand how everything they believed had crumbled so quickly. Their country had told them they were the civilized ones, the orderly ones, the rightful ones. Now they were prisoners, leaving behind everything they knew. But there was something else, too, something far quieter. A question lodged deep inside their chests. If the world they had been shown was a lie, then what was the truth? When they arrived in the United States, the land did not look anything like the broken Europe they had left behind. Instead of ruins, there were towns with clean streets and schoolyards where children played. Instead of fear in every face, there were neighbors chatting outside shops, the smell of fresh bread rising from bakeries, laughter coming from places untouched by war. To the German women, the colors looked brighter here. The sky somehow larger. The world still felt dangerous, but unfamiliar in a way that stirred the mind as much as the heart. When they were marched into their assigned prison camps, they braced for cruelty. They expected guards with fists on triggers. They expected shouts, beatings, humiliation. Many flinched even before anything happened, because that was what they had seen in occupied territories, what they had been told war was. But the American soldiers who watched over them were not filled with hatred. They were young, hungry for peace, tired of blood. Their eyes revealed not anger, but exhaustion. They too were struggling to understand how the world had devolved into such ruin. And then, on a gray morning that began like any other, something utterly ordinary, so ordinary it should have meant nothing at all, crossed the air and changed everything. The smell of frying bacon. It drifted from the kitchen building, curling above the fence like a memory of home. The German women froze, their breath held. For years, meat had been scarce. Food had been rationed. Meals had been survival, not nourishment. And bacon, the rich aroma of fat meeting heat, had become something mythical, a symbol of a world before air raid sirens and hunger. Some women closed their eyes. Others looked down, ashamed of their own desire. A few tried to pretend it didn't matter. But the smell did matter. It was warmth. It was life. It was human. One American cook noticed them standing there, silent. He had grown up on a farm in Iowa, a place where bacon was a simple comfort, not a treasure. He lifted the pan slightly higher, letting the scent carry. He didn't speak German. They didn't speak English. But in that moment, none of that was necessary. Something wordless passed between them, not forgiveness. Not friendship. Not yet. Just the first hint of possibility. Because war teaches people how to hate. But survival teaches them how to see one another. And on that morning, inside a prisoner of war camp, far from home, the first crack of human understanding appeared, not in speeches, not in treaties, not in victory, but in the rising smell of bacon on the air. The camp was surrounded by fences of wood and steel, but the real barriers were the ones inside the women themselves. They had been raised in a country where obedience was stitched into childhood, where questioning meant danger, where loyalty was not a choice but a condition of survival. Even now, thousands of miles from home, that training lingered in their shoulders, their posture, the way their eyes avoided unnecessary contact. They did not speak unless spoken to. They did not ask questions. They did not allow themselves to feel. But the world around them refused to obey the rules they had been taught. American guards greeted each other casually. Laughter could be heard near the barracks when someone told a joke or slipped on muddy ground. Radios played music in English melodies that floated through the air like wind passing over tall grass. The women listened in silence, not because they understood the words, but because they recognized something deeper, the sound of life continuing. Days passed. Then weeks. Hunger eased. Bodies that had grown thin from ration lines, and fear began to strengthen again. The American meals were simple: bread, potatoes, vegetables from nearby farms, but they were consistent. And that consistency did something subtle but profound. It allowed the women to stop bracing for the next disaster. It allowed them to breathe without expecting loss to follow. Yet this new safety did not come without guilt. Some of the women lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, thinking of mothers and siblings still trapped in the ruins of Germany. Their bellies were full here, while the people they loved still stood in ration lines. Some whispered apologies into the darkness. Others clenched their hands into fists beneath the blankets. Even comfort can be painful when it arrives at the wrong time, but the Americans had their own burdens. Many of the guards were young men who had fought through Normandy, who had seen friends fall in fields of wheat and mud. They knew death too. They knew fear. And they were tired of seeing human beings reduced to enemies. Tired of living in a world that expected hardness from them at every turn. So when they looked at the German women, they did not see monsters. They saw people who had also been twisted by war. They saw daughters, sisters, wives. Some saw reflections of the girl they used to read letters from back home. Before the front turned everything into silence. It was in this strange atmosphere, half burden, half quiet understanding, that the camp began to change in ways no commander had planned. One afternoon, an American guard noticed a German woman struggling to sew a torn sleeve. She was frustrated, the needle trembling in her fingers. He hesitated, stepped forward, and motioned toward a better stitching technique he remembered from his mother. She froze at first. Contact across enemy lines was dangerous, not physically, but emotionally. Yet he simply waited. Slowly, cautiously, carefully, she allowed his instruction. For the first time, two people who had been on opposite sides of the most devastating war in human history shared something as small and ordinary as how to mend cloth. After that moment, more cracks formed in the invisible walls. The German women were allowed to work in gardens, to plant vegetables, to pull weeds under the open sky. The earth smelled the same as the earth back home. Soil does not know war. It does not pick sides. And as they worked, shaping rows of lettuce and carrots with hands that once packed ammunition crates or filled factory belts, something inside them began to loosen. They were no longer part of a war machine. They were simply human beings doing useful work. The Americans noticed something else as well. Many of the German women were skilled. They had been trained in mathematics, machinery, radio code, nursing. They were not helpless. They carried knowledge. And knowledge, when taken out of the shadow of ideology, becomes simply ability. One camp officer made a quiet decision. Work assignments would not just be labor. They would be purpose. Soon, women who had once calculated artillery trajectories were helping tabulate farm inventories for local towns. Those who had worked in hospitals assisted in camp infirmary units. A few who spoke fragments of English were allowed to translate messages or help with correspondence. The fences remained. The rules remained. But inside the camp, something new had begun to grow. A different version of identity. One not dictated by propaganda. One not forged in fear, but formed slowly, like dawn. They were still prisoners. But they were no longer just that. And every morning, when the kitchen fires lit and the scent of breakfast drifted into the camp, it reminded them of something they had not dared to consider in years. Life could begin again. Even here, even after everything, even after the world they knew had collapsed. It began with a single voice. A young German woman named Lot had once sung in a church choir before the war had swept her dreams into factories and uniforms. Now, one quiet evening, while the camp settled under fading light, she hummed a tune she remembered from childhood. The melody floated gently, almost fragile, carried on the cooling air. One of the American guards paused mid-step. He recognized the tune, not the words, but the feeling. His grandmother had sung a similar hymn when he was a boy, on Sundays after long meals and summer heat. The connection startled him. It was the first time he heard something in this place that did not belong to war. He did not speak. He simply listened. And for a moment, the fence between them ceased to exist, not because it disappeared, but because both of them simply looked beyond it. From that evening forward, small moments like that began to multiply, quiet as seeds falling into soil. A nurse among the German women offered help when a guard sliced his hand while repairing a tool shed. She did not think about sides or uniforms or history, just the blood, the wound, the instinct to heal. He let her wrap the bandage, though he could have done it himself. Trust did not need to be spoken. It only needed to be allowed. Another time, a young American who had just received a letter from home sat alone behind the barracks, his shoulders trembling, tears he did not want anyone to see slipping down his face. He had learned his brother was missing in the Pacific. One German woman saw him and did not turn away. She knew the shape of grief. Her own brother had vanished on the Eastern Front. She did not speak English, and he did not understand German. Yet they sat together in silence as night settled around them like a blanket of ash. It was not comfort. It was something else, recognition. The guards noticed something unexpected. Discipline did not weaken because kindness entered the camp. In fact, order became steadier. When people are treated as human, they act like humans, not rebels, not threats, not animals trapped behind wire. The women worked with more focus. The guards watched with less suspicion. A strange equilibrium formed, not from command, but from something older, perhaps older than war itself. Still, the past did not vanish. Some women struggled with shame, the weight of what their nation had done. Some guards fought private storms of anger and memory. No one spoke openly of it, but it lingered like smoke that no breeze could quite clear. The war had taken too much to simply disappear. And yet, something inside each of them was changing, not quickly, not dramatically, but steadily, like ice melting beneath the surface before the first drop falls. One afternoon, a farm truck from a nearby town broke down outside the camp. An older farmer, frustrated and embarrassed, kicked at the engine with dusty boots. Before the guards could intervene, one of the German women stepped forward. She had worked in a factory assembling vehicle engines before the war. Her hands knew the language of bolts and pistons better than they knew how to write poetry. She motioned politely, asking if she could look. The farmer hesitated, then stepped aside. Within minutes she had located the jammed valve and cleared it. The truck roared to life, coughing smoke, then settling into a steady rumble. The farmer stared at her, not as an enemy, not as a captured foreigner, but as a person who had helped him when he needed help. He tipped his hat. Not a grand gesture, not a symbol of peace treaties or ending hatred, just respect. That night, the story of the repaired truck passed quietly through the camp, from bunk to bunk, carried in whispers. And though no one said it aloud, each person who heard it felt something shift, a realization that identity was not fixed in stone. That even after the world had torn itself apart, the pieces could sometimes fit together in new shapes. The smell of bacon still drifted through the morning air. The fences still stood. The war had not yet ended for those waiting to return home. But now, the women no longer waited only for release. They waited for who they were becoming. Because the truth had begun to reveal itself. War teaches people to follow orders. But peace teaches them who they truly are. The first letters home arrived slowly, like distant echoes traveling across an ocean of uncertainty. Each envelope was thin, stamped, inspected, censored, handled by hands that did not know the weight they carried. When the mail was distributed, the German women gathered in tight circles, breath held, eyes wide not with joy, but with fear. For some, the letters brought relief, news that parents had survived, that siblings were alive, that home still stood even if the windows were shattered and the walls blackened. But for others, the pages came with silence. No reply. No name. No familiar handwriting. Just absence. And absence in war is a message of its own. One woman named Marta received a letter that shook her to the core. Not because of death, but because of something almost more devastating: forgiveness. Her mother wrote that the town was rebuilding, that neighbors were helping one another sweep rubble from the streets, that the church bells had rung for the first time in months. And then, in a single sentence, her mother wrote, "We do not blame you for what you believed, but now you must choose what you will become." The words struck Marta like a blow. They forced her to face something she had pushed away for months, that the ideology she had been raised inside had been a cage disguised as a home. She did not cry, not at first. She simply folded the letter and held it in both hands, the paper trembling as though alive. Others found courage in smaller, quieter revelations. A girl named Elise received a packet of photographs, her younger sister smiling beside a repaired garden wall, her father standing next to a neighbor as they patched a roof. Life was not waiting for the war to finish. Life was rebuilding itself even in ruins. Elise stared at the pictures for hours, studying every detail, memorizing the shape of hope so she would not forget it. Meanwhile, the Americans watched these moments with the kind of respect that did not need words. They understood grief. They had carried it themselves across battlefields and over oceans. One guard, Private Allen, left a small pencil and extra sheet of paper on the mess table one evening, without explanation. He simply walked away. The women understood what it meant, a gesture of permission. Permission to write more. Permission to reach across the distance that war had carved. The next day, the German women began writing letters not just to family, but to communities back home, letters expressing what they had seen in the American camps. They described the meals, the gardens, the work assignments, the fact that they were treated as human beings, even though the war had placed them on opposite sides. These letters would one day help mend the psychological wounds torn across Europe. But the women did not know that yet. They were simply telling the truth for the first time. However, even within the camp, not all hearts moved easily. Some women clung to the doctrine they had been taught, insisting that kindness was a trick, that the Americans wanted something from them. Fear does not vanish just because no one is threatening you. Sometimes fear grows in silence. It took time, weeks, months for those walls to erode. But they did. Not because anyone forced them to fall, but because reality itself pressed against them like the steady patience of water-shaping stone. The American guards, too, found themselves changed. Some learned German phrases, simple ones at first, Guten Morgen, Danke a bit. A few even requested to learn songs from the German women, in return teaching them American folk tunes. One afternoon, a guard taught a group of women how to toss a baseball properly. At first, they laughed at the unfamiliar motion. But soon, the air was filled with the sound of leather striking leather, sharp, clean, almost joyful. Lot, the girl who once hummed hymns into the evening air, found herself singing more boldly now. Sometimes alone, sometimes with others. The songs were not patriotic. They were not religious. They were melodies of childhood. Innocence reclaimed note by note. The fences still stood. The war was not yet fully over. But inside the camp, the narrative was changing. The German women no longer saw Americans as faceless enemies. The Americans no longer saw German prisoners as shadows of their war. They were, slowly, becoming human to one another. And that realization was more powerful than rifles, more enduring than propaganda, more transformative than victory itself. Because war ends on paper, but peace begins in the heart. News traveled slowly at first, just a rumor carried in whispers. The war in Europe had ended. Germany had surrendered. The Reich was gone. Some women did not believe it. Their minds could not accept a world where the power that had shaped their entire lives simply ceased. But then official word arrived. The guards stood straighter. The officers read orders with quiet voices. And the prisoners, the German women, felt something shift beneath their feet, like the ground had exhaled after holding breath for years. Yet peace did not arrive like a celebration. It arrived like a question. What did it mean to go home to a place that no longer existed as they remembered it? What did it mean to rebuild lives shaped by something they could no longer defend, no longer understand? Freedom, when it came, was not a release from fences, but a step into an unknown future. On the morning the gates opened, there was no grand procession. No bands, no flags. Just a long, slow silence across the camp. The American guards stood by the fences, hands at their sides, not on rifles, but simply resting. They did not smile. They did not cheer. They only watched, acknowledging the complexity of this moment. Some of the women hesitated at the open gate. Their hands gripped small bundles of belongings, letters, a scarf, a book, photos worn soft from touch. They had entered this place as prisoners, but they had lived through something else inside these walls, a transformation that neither side had expected. They had learned that the world was not divided between good and evil, winners and losers, saviors and monsters. It was made of people. Imperfect, hurting, hopeful people. Before stepping forward, one woman turned to an American guard who had once helped her lift sacks of grain in the garden. She did not have the English words for what she wanted to say, and he did not have the German words to receive them. So instead, she placed her hand briefly over her heart and bowed her head. He nodded once, eyes steady, jaw locked tight, not with pride, but with emotion he could not express. Lot, the quiet singer, was one of the last to leave. She paused at the threshold of the gate, listening to the wind. For a moment, she imagined the camp as it had been when she arrived: fear, silence, hunger. And then she remembered how it had changed: music, gardens, letters, unexpected kindness. She inhaled deeply, the scent of earth and grass filling her lungs. Then she stepped forward. The women traveled home by train, just as they had left, but the journeys were not the same. The train cars were not crowded with fear this time, only uncertainty. Villages passed by outside, broken yet trying to stand again. Smoke rose from chimneys, not from ruins. Children played in roads, not rubble. The landscape was scarred, but alive. When the women stepped onto German soil again, they discovered what peace truly meant: not comfort, not celebration, but work. Work to rebuild homes. Work to rebuild trust. Work to rebuild themselves. And in the years that followed, many of them would speak of the camp in America, not as a place of captivity, but as the place where their understanding of the world cracked open. They would tell their children that the enemy they had feared was not who they were told. They would tell them about gardens and songs and letters home. And they would remember the morning smell of bacon, the first scent of a world that had not yet forgiven them, but had allowed them to begin again. REFLESTIO in history often remembers war by its battles, its generals, its destruction. But there are stories hidden behind the gun smoke, stories of ordinary people who were shaped, broken, and remade not by violence, but by what came after. The German women who became prisoners in America discovered something that war tries to erase: that humanity does not belong to one side. That decency can survive even when nations fall. That people can choose kindness even when the world teaches them to hate. The fences in that camp were real. But the greater walls, the ones built from fear, lies, and bitterness, those were the walls that truly mattered. And in time, those walls fell, not through speeches, not through orders, but through small acts of human. RECOGNITIO in a repairing hand. A shared song. A plate of food. The smell of bacon at dawn. It is easy to destroy. It is harder to rebuild. But the most difficult task of all is to see the humanity in those we were taught to fear. And yet, that is where peace truly begins.